Hello friends, and welcome to this new section of the BDM course under the Economics module, which is called Demand and Supply. Demand and supply form the basic foundation for any business when it comes to making decisions, both from a strategic standpoint and from a tactical or operational standpoint. For example, whether a company is deciding how much they need to produce, how much they should price a particular product, or what level of inventory they need to hold, they need to understand the concepts of demand and supply. Similarly, if they are looking at something a little more strategic, for example, if they are planning to enter a new market or planning to come out with a new product or service, they need to understand the concepts of demand and supply. The overall understanding of demand and supply constantly shapes the decisions the management of businesses are trying to make. As business data analysts, our understanding of demand and supply becomes extremely important because organizations today rely heavily on data. They use data to predict customer behavior, forecast sales, optimize pricing, manage production, reduce risks, and so on. They need to constantly look at the demand and supply situation in the industry. Data analysts such as you would be expected to identify patterns in changing demand, understand how to respond to changes in competition, and analyze the impact of those changes on prices. Overall, your role is to help managers make better decisions, largely driven by the underlying data coming from demand and supply rather than simply relying on assumptions. As always throughout this course, we will not just focus on definitions and theoretical concepts. Instead, we will look at the practical application of demand and supply data and understand how businesses make both strategic and operational decisions based on these concepts. Once again, I welcome all of you to this section under the BDM course. I hope all of you will not only learn this very important and fundamental understanding of the market in terms of demand and supply concepts, but also, through the real-life examples that we discuss, better appreciate these concepts and hopefully be able to apply them in the real world. I look forward to working with you in this section on demand and supply. Bye for now.
Hello friends. In this particular video, we will try to understand the basic concepts of demand and supply. We will understand the definitions, the different forms of demand and supply, and the laws that govern demand and supply. We will also understand what a demand schedule and a demand curve are. Finally, we will look at the difference between individual demand and market demand. So, let us get started. As you may have heard me mention, the term market is often used in the context of demand and supply. So, what do we mean when we say a market? A marketplace or market is a place where a group of buyers and sellers interact at a given point in time. Buyers are trying to purchase products or services, while sellers are trying to sell their products or services. There is a whole set of interactions and dynamics that develop between buyers and sellers, either in a particular location or on a particular platform. This is what we refer to as a marketplace. A marketplace has evolved over time. In today's context, a market does not exist only in a physical sense. It has moved beyond physical spaces into virtual spaces as well. Now that we understand what a market is, it is important to understand that there are different forms of markets. For example, there is an organized market. As the name suggests, this is a market that is structured, where buyers and sellers meet at a specific time and place. For example, consider a farmer's market or a mandi. There are groups of sellers, such as vendors or farmers, who are trying to sell their commodities. Then there are buyers who come to purchase those commodities at a given point in time, at a given place, and at a particular price. On the other hand, markets can also be highly unorganized. For example, if you go back in time and think about your childhood, you may remember different ice cream vendors selling ice cream in a town, village, or city. These sellers would be spread across different locations, selling different types of ice creams, and customers would choose which product they wanted to buy. This could happen at different points in time and at different places. This is a basic example of an unorganized market. More structurally, in today's context, markets can also be classified based on the level of competition. For example, consider a particular product where there are many sellers and many buyers. This type of market is called a competitive market because there is a high level of competition among sellers and buyers have multiple options. The important thing to understand here is that the price of a product or service is determined by market forces. It is not influenced by a single buyer or a small group of buyers. Their impact on the final price is very limited, if it exists at all. Theoretically, if we look at a perfectly competitive market, there are two major characteristics. First, the goods or services offered for sale are the same or very similar. There is very little differentiation between them. Second, there are so many buyers and sellers that no single buyer or seller, or group of buyers or sellers, can influence the price. So, in a perfectly competitive market, the goods or services are largely homogeneous, meaning they are similar. No individual buyer or seller has the power to control the final price. The price is determined by market forces. Now, in reality, perfectly competitive markets may not always exist. There can be situations where there is only one seller or only a few sellers. When there is only one seller, the market is called a monopolistic market or a monopoly. A monopoly means that a single organization controls the supply of a product or service. For example, when you need to buy a railway ticket, historically there was a single major platform for railway ticket booking, which was IIT. Similarly, in some industries, such as oil and gas, there have been situations where a single organization had a dominant position. This kind of situation is called a monopoly. At the same time, there can be situations where there are not just one seller, but only a few sellers. Such a market structure is called an oligopolistic market or an oligopoly. Here, the market is dominated by a small number of players. For example, consider the Indian telecom industry. There are not hundreds of telecom providers. There are only a few major companies operating in the market. In an oligopoly, pricing is not determined purely by free market forces. It is also influenced by the bargaining power and negotiation power of these few companies. When there are fewer sellers, their ability to influence the market becomes much higher. Now that we understand what a market is and the different forms of markets, it is useful to understand what we mean when we say there is demand for a product or service. Demand means the quantity of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at different prices during a given period of time. The key elements of this definition are: first, demand requires willingness to buy. There must be a desire or need for the product or service. However, willingness alone is not enough. The consumer must also have the ability to buy, which means they must have the purchasing power. Demand also considers different prices because the quantity demanded changes depending on the price. For example, if the price of a product increases, the willingness or ability of consumers to buy it may decrease. Therefore, demand is the willingness and ability to purchase a good or service at different prices over a given period of time. For example, a person may want to buy a BMW or a Mercedes, but if they cannot afford it, this is not considered demand in economics. It is simply a desire or a wish. When companies perform demand analysis, they are looking at customers who are not only willing to buy, but also have the ability to purchase the product at a particular price. So, the key takeaway is demand must be backed by purchasing power. Now, from an economic perspective, we have something called the law of demand. The law of demand states that, other things remaining the same, when the price of a product rises, the quantity demanded for that product falls. This is also known as ceteris paribus, which means all other factors remaining constant. For example, suppose you want to buy a mug and the price of the mug is 50 rupees. At that price, you may buy 5 mugs. Now, if the price increases from 50 rupees to 100 rupees, would you buy the same number of mugs? Probably not, because your ability to buy has reduced. Therefore, when the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded falls. When the price falls, the quantity demanded increases, assuming other factors remain unchanged. This is the law of demand. When we put this relationship between price and quantity demanded into a table, it is called a demand schedule. A demand schedule is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity demanded. When this relationship is represented graphically, it is called a demand curve. A demand curve shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded. The demand curve is downward sloping because as the price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. For example, consider an ice cream cone. If the price of an ice cream cone is 1 unit, the quantity demanded may be 8 cones. If the price increases to 3 units, demand may fall to 0. At an intermediate price, such as 1.5 units, demand may reduce from 8 cones to 6 cones. This graph shows that quantity demanded changes as price changes. A lower price increases demand, while a higher price reduces demand. Now, we usually do not study demand only at an individual level. Instead, we often look at total demand, which is called market demand. Market demand is the sum total of individual demands for a particular product or service. In other words, the quantity demanded in a market is the combined demand of all buyers at a given price and during a given period of time. Market demand also has a demand curve, which shows how total quantity demanded changes with changes in price. For example, suppose the price of an ice cream cone is 2 units. Person A demands 4 ice cream cones, and Person B demands 3 ice cream cones. The total market demand is 4 plus 3 equals 7 ice cream cones. This is how market demand is calculated. Now that we understand demand, let us understand the supply side. Supply is the quantity of a good or service that sellers are willing and able to provide for sale at different prices during a given period of time. Similar to demand, supply has 2 important elements. First, sellers must be willing to sell. Second, sellers must have the ability or capacity to sell. For example, if a manufacturing facility can produce only 10,000 units of a product, can it supply more than 10,000 units? No, because it does not have the production capacity. Therefore, supply depends on both willingness and ability. Supply also changes based on price. Think like a business owner. If the price of your product increases, you can earn more profit. This increases your willingness to produce and sell more. However, if the price decreases significantly, you may not want to sell because you might make a loss. Therefore, higher prices generally lead to higher supply because producers are motivated by profit. This is the basic idea of supply. Now let us understand the law of supply. The law of supply states that, other things remaining the same, when the price of a good or service increases, the quantity supplied by producers also increases. Unlike demand, supply moves in the opposite direction. For demand, higher price. Low quantity demanded for supply, higher price. Higher quantity supplied when prices rise. Producers are more willing to supply because selling becomes more profitable. However, supply is still limited by production capacity. A company cannot produce unlimited quantities simply because prices increase. If the relationship between price and quantity supplied is shown in a table, it is called a supply schedule. When it is shown graphically, it is called a supply curve. Just like market, demand is the combination of all individual demands. Market supply is the combined supply of all sellers in a market. The supply curve shows how quantity supplied changes when price changes, assuming other factors remain constant. Unlike the demand curve, the supply curve slopes upward. This is because as prices increase, sellers become more willing to supply the product. For example, with ice cream cones, at a low price, sellers may supply 2 cones. At a higher price, they may supply 5 cones. Therefore, the supply curve moves upward. With that, we will close this video. In the next video, we will understand different demand curves and supply curves. We will also bring these 2 concepts together. So far, We have studied demand and supply separately. Next, we will combine them and understand the concept of equilibrium price. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye for now.
Hello friends. In the last video, we tried to understand some of the fundamental concepts of demand and supply. In this video, we will go a step further and understand what is called the demand curve, what is called the supply curve, what causes shifts in demand and supply curves, and how prices are determined, which is called equilibrium pricing. So, let us get started. As we discussed earlier, a demand curve shows the relationship between the quantity demanded and the price of a product. As you can see from the graph, when there is a change in the price of a particular product, there is a corresponding change in the quantity demanded. The demand for a good or service typically increases when the price decreases. For example, in the previous discussion, when the price point was 1 unit, the quantity demanded was 8 units. When the price doubled to 2 units, the quantity demanded reduced from 8 units to 4 units. The key point is that the demand curve is downward sloping when we plot price on the y-axis and quantity demanded on the x-axis. As demand increases, the price generally reduces. For example, at a price point of $3, the quantity demanded may become 0. However, when the price falls to half a dollar, the quantity demanded may increase to 10 units. Now, what do we mean by a shift in the demand curve? The demand curve shifts when any factor that affects a buyer's desire or ability to purchase changes the quantity demanded at any given price point. An increase in demand means that the quantity demanded increases at a given price point. This causes the demand curve to shift to the right. A decrease in demand means the quantity demanded reduces at a given price point. This causes the demand curve to shift to the left. So, if demand increases, the demand curve moves from left to right. If demand decreases, it moves from right to left. Now, what variables cause the demand curve to shift? There are many factors, but some important ones that you, as a data analyst or business analyst, should focus on are the following. 1. Income levels of consumers. If consumer income increases, the demand for a normal good generally increases. For example, if employment levels and salaries increase, demand for consumer goods such as automobiles may also increase. However, if demand increases when income falls, the product is considered an inferior good. For example, if a person's income decreases, they may stop buying a car and start using public transport instead. Therefore, it is important to understand what type of product the business is dealing with and how changes in income affect demand. 2. Prices of related goods. When analysing demand, it is also important to understand the prices of related products. Related goods can be either substitute goods, complementary goods. Substitute goods are products that can replace each other. For example, ice cream and frozen yogurt. If the price of ice cream decreases, people may buy more ice cream and reduce their demand for frozen yogurt. This is because the two products compete with each other. Complementary goods are products that are consumed together. For example, ice cream and hot fudge. If the price of one complementary good decreases, the demand for the other may increase because they are usually consumed together. 3. Consumer preferences and taste. Another important factor that shifts demand is consumer preference. For example, a fitness trend can increase demand for products related to health and fitness. Protein shakes are an example where demand can rise because consumers' preferences shift toward fitness-oriented lifestyles. 4. Future expectations. Expectations about future prices can also affect demand. For example, if consumers expect fuel prices to increase in the future, they may buy more fuel today to avoid paying higher prices later. This causes a shift in current demand because consumer expectations have changed. 5. Number of buyers. Another factor is the number of buyers in the market. For example, if a company sets up a factory in a location and creates employment for 2,000 people, those new employees become additional consumers. This can increase demand for consumer products and durable goods in that area. So, While there is a strong relationship between price and demand, shifts in demand can happen due to many other variables. As a data analyst, when forecasting demand, it is important to consider how these variables are expected to behave in both the short term and long term. Now, let us take a specific example: cigarette smoking. Suppose policymakers want to reduce cigarette consumption. They may launch public awareness campaigns explaining the harmful effects of smoking. In this case, the price does not change, but demand shifts. The original demand at a particular price may have been 20 units. After public awareness campaigns discourage smoking, the demand curve shifts from point A to point B. The price remains the same, but the number of cigarettes consumed decreases. This is an example of a shift in demand caused by changes in consumer preferences and awareness. Another way demand can decrease is through a change in price. For example, if the government wants to discourage smoking, it may impose additional taxes. Because of these taxes, suppliers increase the price of cigarettes. Suppose the price increases from 2 units to 4 units. In this case, the demand curve itself does not shift. Instead, the quantity demanded moves along the same demand curve, decreasing from 20 units to 12 units. This is called a movement along the demand curve. So, there are two different concepts: shift in demand curve caused by factors other than price. Movement along demand curve caused by change in price. Now, let us look at the same concept in the context of supply. As discussed earlier, the supply curve is upward sloping. This means that when the price increases, suppliers are willing to supply more because they can earn higher profits. However, supply curves can also shift. What causes a shift in the supply curve? 1. Changes in input prices. If the cost of inputs increases, production becomes less profitable. For example, if raw material prices increase while selling prices remain the same, profits decrease. This can reduce supply. 2. Technology improvement. Advances in technology can increase supply. Better technology can reduce labor costs, improve efficiency, and create economies of scale. This lowers production costs and allows businesses to produce more. Therefore, technology improvements usually increase supply. 3. Future expectations. If firms expect prices to increase in the future, they may store some current production and sell it later at a higher price. This can reduce current supply. 4. Number of sellers. The number of sellers also affects supply. If many sellers leave the market, the total ability to produce and sell decreases. Therefore, changes in the number of sellers can shift the supply curve. These factors are not the only ones. Other variables may also affect supply depending on the product or service being analysed. Now, let us bring demand and supply together. The price of a product is determined when the demand and supply curves intersect. This price is called the equilibrium price. Equilibrium is the point where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. At equilibrium, quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. This creates a balance in the market. Now, what happens when the market moves away from equilibrium? Surplus situation. A surplus occurs when the market price is above the equilibrium price. At a higher price, suppliers want to sell more, but consumers do not want to buy as much. This creates excess supply. To correct this, businesses reduce prices to attract more buyers and move back toward the equilibrium price. Shortage situation. The opposite happens when the market price is below equilibrium. At a low price, demand increases, but suppliers are not willing or able to provide enough goods. This creates a shortage. To correct this, sellers increase prices until supply and demand come back into balance. In a free market, prices naturally adjust to bring quantity supplied and quantity demanded into equilibrium. Now let us understand equilibrium graphically. The demand curve shows lower price. Higher demand. The supply curve shows higher price. Higher supply. The point where these two curves meet is the equilibrium point. From a quantity perspective, it gives the equilibrium quantity. From a pricing perspective, it gives the equilibrium price. As data analysts, We often perform what-if analysis to understand what happens when demand or supply shifts. Ultimately, businesses want to determine the best price that allows them to maximize returns or profits. For example, consider ice cream sales during summer. During summer, demand increases because more people want ice cream. The demand curve shifts from D1 to D2. Supply remains unchanged. Because demand has increased, a new equilibrium price is created. The price may increase from 2 units to 2.5 units. The equilibrium quantity may increase from 7 units to 10 units. The reason is the seasonal increase in demand. Therefore, by analyzing demand and supply shifts, businesses can adjust pricing strategies based on expected market conditions. This is the overall understanding of demand curve, supply curve, shifts in demand and supply, the intersection of demand and supply, determination of equilibrium price, how changes in variables affect prices. I hope you learned from this video. I look forward to meeting you in the next video. Thank you, and bye for now. Elasticity of demand. Hello friends. In this video, we will try to understand in depth what we mean when we say elasticity of demand or demand elasticity. Let's quickly get started with the concept. When somebody says, the demand for this particular product is elastic, or the demand is inelastic, what does that really mean? It means we are talking about the degree of responsiveness of demand with respect to change in price. Fundamentally, elasticity means understanding how much one variable changes when another variable changes. It is the degree of responsiveness between two variables. In the context of demand elasticity, we're trying to understand, when there is a change in price, how much does the demand for that product change? When demand is considered elastic or highly elastic, it means the quantity demanded changes substantially when there is a change in price. On the other hand, when demand is inelastic or less elastic, it means the change in demand is much smaller compared to the change in price. Example, Netflix subscription. Let's take an example of Netflix. Suppose Netflix increases its prices tomorrow, and the service becomes unaffordable for many customers. As a result, many people cancel their subscriptions. Would we call this demand elastic or inelastic? This means the demand for Netflix is elastic because a change in price caused a large change in demand. Now think about something more critical. Given the geopolitical situation, suppose petrol prices increase. Do you think demand for petrol will substantially decrease because the price increased? The answer is probably no. Therefore, petrol is considered to have inelastic demand. What determines elasticity of demand? What are the factors that determine elasticity of demand? While there are no universal rules, there are some basic principles that you should look at when analysing the elasticity of a product or service. 1. Availability of substitutes. The first factor is competition and the availability of substitutes in the market. If your product has many close substitutes, the demand will usually be more elastic. Why? Because consumers can easily switch from your product to a competing product. However, if your product is unique or highly differentiated, elasticity will usually be lower. For example, consider butter. There are substitutes available for butter. If the price of butter increases, people can switch to other alternatives. But consider eggs. If the price of eggs increases, are there many close substitutes? Not really. Therefore, demand for eggs is relatively less elastic. 2. Type of good. Necessity vs luxury. The second factor is the type of good. Is the product a necessity or a luxury? If the product or service is critical or necessary, demand is usually inelastic. However, products that are nice to have or luxury products usually have highly elastic demand. For example, a doctor's visit is generally a necessity. Therefore, demand for medical services tends to be inelastic. But luxury products, luxury goods, and luxury services usually have more elastic demand. So the type of product has a major impact on elasticity. 3. Definition of the market. The third factor is the market you are serving. A narrowly defined market usually has more elastic demand than a broadly defined market. For example, Consider a specific product such as vanilla ice cream. This is a narrowly defined product, so consumers can easily find alternatives. Therefore, demand is more elastic. However, if you define the market broadly as food products in general, it becomes harder to find substitutes. Therefore, demand becomes more inelastic. 4. Time horizon. Another important factor is time. Goods tend to have more elastic demand over a longer period of time. For example, consider petrol. Because there are limited immediate substitutes, demand will not fall immediately when petrol prices increase. However, over a longer period, people may move toward alternatives such as electric vehicles. Therefore, demand becomes more elastic over time. So it is important to understand the time horizon when analyzing how demand changes with pricing. How do we calculate elasticity of demand? We know elasticity measures the change in demand with respect to change in price. Mathematically, it is calculated as elasticity of demand equals percentage change in quantity demanded. Percentage change in price. This ratio tells us the level of elasticity. For example, suppose the price of an ice cream cone increases by 10%. Because of this, the quantity demanded falls by 20%. The calculation would be 20%. 10% equals 2. This means the demand is highly elastic. If the ratio is greater than 1, demand is elastic. Less than 1, demand is inelastic. Equal to 1, demand is unit elastic. Types of demand elasticity. There are 5 major types of demand elasticity: elastic demand, inelastic demand, unit elastic demand, perfectly elastic demand, perfectly inelastic demand. Elastic demand. Elastic demand means a small change in price causes a relatively larger change in quantity demanded. Examples include restaurants and branded clothing. These are often considered good-to-have products, so consumers can reduce their consumption when prices increase. Inelastic demand. Elastic demand means a change in price causes only a small change in quantity demanded. Sometimes demand may not change at all. Examples include medicines and petrol. These are important goods, so consumers continue buying them even when prices increase. Unit elastic demand. Unit elastic demand is a theoretical case. Here, the percentage change in price is exactly equal to the percentage change in quantity demanded. For example, a 10% fall in price causes a 10% increase in demand. The proportional change remains the same. Perfectly elastic demand. Perfectly elastic demand means even a tiny increase in price causes demand to fall significantly. This usually occurs in highly competitive markets with many substitutes. For example, if one seller increases the price of a commodity slightly, consumers can immediately switch to another seller. Perfectly inelastic demand. Perfectly inelastic demand means demand remains constant regardless of price changes. These are extremely critical goods. For example, life-saving insulin for diabetic patients. Even if the price changes, demand may not reduce because the product is essential. Elasticity shown graphically in these graphs. The y-axis represents price. The x-axis represents quantity demanded. For unit elastic demand, the percentage change in price and quantity demanded is the same. For elastic demand, a change in price causes a much larger change in quantity demanded because substitutes are available. For inelastic demand, a change in price causes only a small change in quantity demanded. For perfectly elastic demand, any increase in price can reduce demand to 0. For perfectly inelastic demand, demand remains unchanged regardless of price. Impact of elasticity on revenue. As a data analyst, the key question is, how does elasticity affect revenue? Total revenue is total revenue equals quantity sold. Price or TR equals P. Q. If demand is elastic, increasing the price usually decreases total revenue. Why? Because the fall in quantity demanded is much larger than the increase in price. So when we multiply the new price by the new quantity sold, revenue falls. However, if demand is inelastic, increasing the price tends to increase revenue. Why? Because the quantity demanded does not decrease significantly. Therefore, elastic demand. Increasing price reduces revenue in elastic demand. Increasing price increases revenue unit elastic demand. Revenue remains approximately the same as a data analyst. It is important to understand where your product lies compared to competitors, how differentiated your product is, and what type of market you are serving. Then you can predict how price change, whether caused by increasing costs or competition, will affect demand and ultimately the revenue of the firm. This was an overview of elasticity and demand elasticity. In the next video, we will discuss elasticity in the context of supply, where we will study supply elasticity. Thank you.
Hello friends. In the previous video, we discussed the concept of elasticity of demand. In today's video, we will try to understand the same concept of elasticity from the point of view of supply. We will understand the key variables that impact supply elasticity, how to compute supply elasticity, the different types of supply elasticity, and some supply elasticity curves. Finally, after discussing a couple of case studies, we will also touch upon the concepts of economies of scale and economies of scope. So, let's get started. Elasticity of supply. What is elasticity of supply? Price elasticity of supply essentially measures how much the quantity supplied changes in response to a change in price. If you remember, when we discussed price elasticity of demand, we were trying to measure how much demand changes when price changes. Here, the difference is that we are looking at the producer's or supplier's perspective. We are trying to understand how much the quantity supplied changes in response to a change in price. We consider supply to be elastic if the quantity supplied changes significantly in response to a price change. The change can be large or substantial. On the other hand, supply is considered elastic if the response is marginal or there is almost no change. Since supply is looked at from the seller's perspective, the entire concept depends heavily on the flexibility of sellers to change the quantity they supply. Supply becomes more elastic when companies or firms are able to respond quickly to changes in price. This is only possible when they have enough resources and are not restricted by capacity or production limitations. Similarly, their ability to adjust production also affects supply elasticity. Supply becomes inelastic when sellers face constraints. For example, if their production capacity is fixed and they are already operating at 95 or 98% of their capacity, they will not be able to increase supply much beyond that limit. In that case, supply becomes inelastic. Another example is when increasing production takes a long time. If the production process requires significant time, then supply becomes less responsive to price changes. Finally, if the resources required to produce the goods, such as raw materials or labor, are difficult to obtain, supply again becomes inelastic. Factors affecting supply elasticity. So what are the factors that impact supply elasticity? There are several important variables. The first and one of the most important factors is the time horizon. The longer the period of time available for firms to adjust production, the more elastic supply becomes. For example, a car manufacturer can increase production much more easily over a longer period compared to a very short period. Therefore, the time available has a major impact on elasticity. The second factor is the availability of spare production capacity. The more unused capacity a company has, the more elastic its supply can be because it can quickly increase production. For example, if a factory is operating at only 40, 50, or 60% capacity, it can raise output relatively quickly. However, if it is already operating near full capacity, increasing production becomes difficult. The third factor is the availability of inputs. From a supplier's perspective, access to raw materials, labor, and other resources determines how quickly production can increase. If labor is unavailable or raw materials are difficult to obtain, the ability to supply is restricted, which reduces elasticity. The easier it is to access inputs required for production, the higher the supply elasticity. For example, in the software services industry, availability of skilled labor determines how quickly a company can expand and meet increased demand. The fourth factor is the nature of the product. The type of product being supplied also affects elasticity. Perishable or unique goods tend to have more inelastic supply. For example, fresh fruits and vegetables can spoil quickly, so producers cannot always adjust supply easily. Technology also plays an important role. Better technology improves productivity and allows companies to scale production faster. Automation, for example, can help firms increase their output and make supply more elastic. Government regulation is another important factor. Heavy regulations that restrict production can reduce supply elasticity. For example, companies in the mining sector often face licensing restrictions. Their ability to expand capacity or start new production can take a long time because they must follow multiple permissions and procedures. Therefore, government regulation can significantly impact supply elasticity. In summary, the major variables affecting supply elasticity include time horizon, availability of spare capacity, availability of inputs, and labour nature of the product. Technology. Government regulations. As a data analyst, you should think about these factors from your company's perspective and from the industry you operate in. You need to understand how quickly can your company respond to market changes. What production capacity do you have? What resources are needed to scale up? How much does technology help improve efficiency? Are there regulations restricting production? All these factors determine how elastic your supply can be. I continue with Part 2, calculation of supply elasticity, classification, curves, case studies, economies of scale, and scope next. OK, Part 2. Supply elasticity calculation, types, curves, and case studies. Now that we have understood the fundamental concept of supply elasticity, let us look at how we compute it. Similar to how we calculated price elasticity of demand, we use a similar approach for price elasticity of supply. For demand elasticity, we calculated percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. For supply elasticity, we calculate percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price. Let us take an example. Suppose the price of milk increases by 10% because of increased demand or some other reason. This increase in price allows dairy farmers to increase their production by 20%. What would be the elasticity of supply? Earlier, suppose farmers were able to supply 100 gallons of milk. Now they can supply 120 gallons. The change in quantity supplied is 120 minus 100 equals 20 gallons. The percentage change in quantity supplied is 20%. The change in price is 10%. So, elasticity of supply equals 20% divided by 10% equals 2 since the value is greater than 1. This is considered an elastic supply. Similar to demand elasticity, if elasticity is greater than 1, supply is elastic. If elasticity is less than 1, supply is inelastic. If elasticity is equal to 1, supply is unit elastic. Classification of supply elasticity. Supply elasticity can be classified into 5 categories: elastic supply, inelastic supply, unit elastic supply, perfectly elastic supply, perfectly inelastic supply. Elastic supply. Elastic supply means a small change in price leads to a significant change in quantity supplied. For example, clothing manufacturers may rapidly increase production during festive seasons. This suggests elastic supply because they are able to respond quickly. However, this assumes they are not constrained by resources or production capacity. Inelastic supply means a change in price causes only a small change in quantity supplied. It is difficult to quickly increase production even if prices rise. Agricultural goods are a good example. Farmers cannot immediately increase crop production because crops require time to grow. Therefore, agricultural products tend to have relatively inelastic supply in the short run. Unit elastic supply. Unit elastic supply means the percentage change in quantity supplied is exactly equal to the percentage change in price. For example, a 10% fall in price leads to a 10% rise in supply. The elasticity value is exactly 1. Perfectly elastic supply. Perfectly elastic supply means suppliers are willing to supply any quantity at one fixed price, but not at a lower price. This is usually associated with highly competitive markets. For example, in commodity markets with very small profit margins, suppliers may be willing to provide any quantity at the market price. However, if the price falls, supplying becomes unprofitable. Perfectly inelastic supply. Perfectly inelastic supply means the quantity supplied remains constant regardless of price changes. The supply cannot increase or decrease. Examples include rare paintings by an artist who is no longer alive. A fixed amount of land available on an island. No matter how much the price changes, the supply remains fixed. Supply elasticity curves. Now let us look at supply elasticity curves. In the case of unit elastic supply, elasticity equals 1. Any change in price causes a proportional change in quantity supplied. The price and quantity supplied change by the same percentage. For an elastic supply curve, a change in price creates a much larger change in quantity supplied. This means producers can respond strongly to price changes. For a perfectly elastic supply curve, suppliers can provide an unlimited quantity at a particular price. However, if the price falls below that level, they will not supply. For a perfectly inelastic supply curve, quantity supplied does not change at all regardless of the price. The supply remains fixed. Elasticity changes along the supply curve. Elasticity can also vary along the same supply curve. For companies with limited production capacity, elasticity is higher at lower production levels. Why? Because companies can easily use spare capacity. However, when capacity utilization reaches very high levels, such as 90, 95, or 98%, increasing additional supply becomes difficult. The firm becomes constrained by capacity, making supply less elastic. Case Study 1: Technology and Farming. Let us understand supply elasticity through a real-life example. Imagine a new invention that allows farmers to increase crop production significantly. For example, researchers develop a hybrid wheat crop that produces much higher output. Because of this technological improvement, farmers can increase supply. The supply curve shifts to the right. However, the demand curve remains mostly unchanged because consumers' ability or desire to buy wheat does not increase just because farmers can produce more. This creates a situation of excess supply. When supply increases while demand remains constant, the market faces a surplus. In a surplus situation, quantity available increases. Equilibrium price falls. The reason this happens is because wheat has relatively inelastic demand. Even if the price decreases significantly, consumers do not dramatically increase how much wheat they buy. From a revenue perspective, farmers may actually earn less. The reason is the increase in quantity sold is not large enough to compensate for the fall in price. This explains a paradox in agricultural policy. Sometimes policies intended to help farmers can actually reduce farmer income. For example, governments may pay farmers not to plant crops. By reducing supply, prices increase, which can increase total revenue for farmers. Case Study 2: OPEC and oil prices. Another example comes from the oil industry. In the 1970s, OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, reduced oil supply to increase prices and revenue. Oil demand is relatively inelastic because consumers still need oil even when prices rise. In the short term, oil supply is also inelastic. Why? Because oil reserves and extraction capacity cannot be changed overnight. You cannot suddenly increase oil production just because prices rise. When supply decreased while demand remained constant, a shortage occurred. In a shortage situation, prices increase. Revenues increase for suppliers. However, in the long run, things changed. Non-OPEC producers increased exploration and built production capacity. Consumers also responded by conserving energy and using more efficient vehicles. This shows the importance of time horizon. In the long run, both supply and demand become more elastic because producers and consumers have more time to adjust. Economies of scale. Finally, let us understand economies of scale from the supplier's perspective. Economies of scale means that firms can produce larger quantities at a lower average cost per unit. When a company produces more units, the cost of producing each individual unit decreases. This happens because fixed costs are spread across a larger number of products. For example, if a factory produces 1,000 products, the cost per product is high. If it produces 1 million products, the fixed costs are distributed across many more units. Therefore, average cost falls. When costs decrease while prices remain similar, profitability improves. This gives companies a competitive advantage. This is one reason why companies offer bulk discounts. Producing at a larger scale allows them to reduce costs and serve more customers. Economies of scope. Economies of scope refers to reducing costs by producing a variety of products using shared resources. Instead of using resources for only one product, a company can use the same resources across multiple products. For example, a team that produces one product may also be able to support 3 different products. The company can share employees, technology, equipment, distribution systems. This reduces production costs. Economies of scope allow companies to become more efficient and expand across multiple product categories. Both economies of scale and economies of scope improve efficiency and create competitive advantages. With this, we come to the end of the section on demand and supply. We discussed demand curves, supply curves, elasticity, economies of scale, economies of scope. This was a basic foundation of economics. As we move forward, we will explore microeconomics and macroeconomics in greater depth.